The story of Fidel Castro begins far away from the bustling streets of Havana, in the quiet, green countryside of eastern Cuba. To understand the man who would later defy the United States and reshape his country, we must look at the place where he was born and the family that shaped his earliest years. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, in the small rural locality of Birán, which is part of the Holguin province. At the time of his birth, this area was a remote and rugged part of Cuba, dominated by vast expanses of agricultural land, dense forests, and the changing rhythms of rural life. The environment of Birán left a deep and lasting mark on Fidel, instilling in him a lifelong connection to the land and a familiarity with the realities of rural existence. Fidel's father, Angel Castro y Arges, was a remarkable and formidable figure in his own right. Born in a small village in Galicia, Spain, Angel had arrived in Cuba as a young man, initially as a soldier sent to fight for Spain during the Cuban War of Independence, or perhaps simply as an immigrant seeking a better life. Through hard work, shrewd business sense, and relentless ambition, Angel transformed himself from a penniless laborer into a wealthy and successful landowner. He established a sprawling estate in Birán, centered around a large farm that produced sugarcane, cattle, timber, and various crops. Angel's success was a testament to the classic immigrant dream of upward mobility through sheer determination, but it also placed him in a position of significant local power and privilege. Growing up on his father's estate, young Fidel experienced a childhood that was privileged compared to the lives of the impoverished peasants who worked the surrounding fields. Yet it was also isolated and rustic. The Birán estate functioned almost like a self-contained village. It featured a general store, a hotel, a post office, a slaughterhouse, and a school, all managed or owned by Angel Castro. Workers, sharecroppers, and laborers came to the estate to earn their livelihoods, creating a complex social ecosystem under Angel's patriarchal rule. Fidel grew up observing this microcosm of Cuban rural society daily. He saw how his father wielded authority, how business was conducted, and how the laborers lived and worked. These early observations planted the seeds of his awareness of social hierarchies and economic disparities. Fidel's mother, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, had a very different background and personality. Originally from a humble rural family, Lina had worked as a domestic servant in the Castro household before becoming Angel's second wife. She was known for being hardworking, deeply religious, and practical, managing the massive household and raising a large family. Fidel was one of several children born to Angel and Lina, alongside his brothers Raul and Ramon and his sisters. Growing up in a household with a dynamic, commanding father and a grounded, industrious mother shaped Fidel's emerging personality. He inherited his father's iron willpower, boundless energy, and defiance of authority, traits that would define his entire adult life. Education played a crucial role in shaping Fidel's early ambitions, though his path through school was anything but conventional. As a young boy, he was sent away from the comfort of Birán to attend various schools in Santiago de Cuba and later in Havana. This transition from the isolated countryside to structured institutional education was challenging for Fidel. He attended strict Catholic boarding schools run by Jesuits and other religious orders, such as the Colegio de Dolores in Santiago de Cuba and the Colegio de Belén in Havana. These institutions were elite schools catering to the upper crust of Cuban society, providing a rigorous classical education, discipline, and moral instruction. At school, Fidel stood out not only for his towering physical presence and athletic prowess, particularly in baseball and basketball, but also for his fierce competitive spirit. He was a restless and independent student who often chafed against strict rules and institutional discipline. However, he possessed a sharp intellect and a voracious appetite for reading. He immersed himself in history, literature, and the biographies of great military and political leaders. Figures like Napoleon Bonaparte and various heroes of Latin American independence, such as Simón Bolívar and José Martí, captured his imagination. These readings fueled his growing sense of destiny and a deep-seated desire to leave a mark on the world. Despite his privileged upbringing and elite education, Fidel developed an acute sense of injustice during his youth. He was deeply aware of the stark contrast between his family's wealth and the severe poverty experienced by the rural poor in the surrounding countryside of Orient Province. While his father was a benevolent patriarch in the eyes of many, Fidel witnessed firsthand the struggles of tenant farmers and landless laborers who lacked basic access to healthcare, education, and economic security. These early impressions fostered a nascent rebellion against the status quo. He began to question why some people lived in abundance, while the vast majority of rural Cubans struggled just to survive. As he grew into a young man, Fidel's ambition expanded beyond the boundaries of Birán and the schoolyard. He possessed an extraordinary level of physical stamina and mental focus, often pushing himself and those around him to the absolute limit. His teachers noted his remarkable powers of concentration and his ability to speak passionately and persuasively, even at a young age. These qualities made him a natural leader among his peers, though his leadership style was often forceful and uncompromising. He demanded excellence from himself and expected others to follow his lead. The early experiences in Birán and his formative years in school laid the foundational traits that would drive Fidel Castro's future actions. The combination of rural resilience, a demanding and successful father, an elite education, and a growing sensitivity to social inequality created a complex psychological profile. He was ambitious, proud, intellectually curious, and fiercely determined to overcome any obstacle in his path. As he prepared to leave the structured environment of school for the turbulent world of the University of Havana, Fidel Castro was a young man primed for action, carrying within him a burning ambition and a developing sense of justice that would soon propel him into the heart of Cuban national politics. The transition from the elite, structured halls of the Colegio de Belén in Havana to the roaring, chaotic atmosphere of the University of Havana marked a definitive turning point in Fidel Castro's life. In the autumn of 1945, a tall, intense, and deeply ambitious 19-year-old Fidel walked through the neoclassical gates of Cuba's premier institution of higher education. He enrolled in the Faculty of Law, a traditional stepping stone for ambitious young men from privileged or aspiring families who wished to enter national politics, jurisprudence, or government administration. However, the University of Havana in the mid-1940s was far more than an academic institution. It was the pulsing, volatile epicenter of Cuban political life, a crucible where the nation's deepest societal tensions, violent political rivalries, and fervent nationalistic aspirations collided head-on. To understand the transformation that Fidel underwent during his university years, one must examine the state of Cuba during this era. Following the turbulent overthrow of Gerardo Machado in 1933 and the subsequent rise and fall of various political factions, Cuba was governed under the Constitution of 1940, a progressive document on paper but deeply compromised in practice by systemic corruption, institutional decay, and profound economic inequality. The country was nominally a democracy, Yet political power was frequently manipulated by entrenched elites, corrupt politicians, and powerful foreign interests, particularly from the United States, which dominated Cuba's sugar industry, utilities, and commercial sectors. Ordinary Cubans faced high unemployment, inflation, and a lack of basic social services, while a succession of administrations led by presidents like Ramon Grau, San Martin failed to deliver on promises of sweeping reform. Disillusionment was widespread, and the nation's youth, particularly university students, viewed themselves as the moral conscience of the Republic, charged with the sacred duty of rescuing Cuba from its political malaise. The University of Havana was uniquely structured to foster this radical political consciousness. Campus autonomy, a hard-won privilege that protected university grounds from the direct entry of police and state security forces, had transformed the campus into a sanctuary for political debate, clandestine meetings, and, increasingly, armed radicalism. Within this walled intellectual ecosystem, students did not merely study law, medicine, or philosophy. They organized, debated ideologies, formed political factions, and prepared for direct action. The student body was intensely politicized, divided into various competing groups, factions, and youth wings of national political parties. These groups ranged from moderate social democrats to fierce nationalists, communists, and syndicalists. In this charged environment, Fidel Castro found a canvas large enough to match his boundless energy and his growing hunger for influence and leadership. Upon arriving on campus, Fidel quickly realized that academic success alone would not satisfy his driving ambition. He immersed himself immediately in the turbulent sea of student politics. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with an imposing physical presence, a booming voice, and an unmatched capacity for tireless speech-making, Fidel commanded attention. He possessed a sharp, retentive mind and an aggressive debating style that quickly made him a notable figure among his peers. Yet, university politics in 1940s Havana was not merely a matter of eloquent speeches and parliamentary debate. It was a deadly game dominated by armed student gangs, known as action groups or gangsterism. These groups, such as the Unión Insurreccional Revolucionaria (UR) and the Movimiento Socialista Revolucionario (MSR), functioned essentially as campus mafias. They controlled university resources, extorted professors and local businesses, protected their political patrons in the national government, and settled ideological and personal disputes with pistols and Tommy guns. Violence was an everyday reality on campus. Assassinations, shootouts, and turf wars were common occurrences that claimed the lives of numerous students and faculty members. Fidel's early political alignment and his association with these radical currents form one of the most heavily scrutinized and debated periods of his biographical history. Initially, he gravitated toward the Partido Auténtico, led by Ramon Grau San Martin, which had captured the hopes of many young Cubans with its anti-imperialist rhetoric and promises of national renewal. However, the Auténtico administration's rapid descent into corruption and patronage deeply disillusioned Fidel, as it did many idealistic youths. To survive and rise within the cutthroat environment of the university, Fidel aligned himself with militant factions, seeking protection and a vehicle for his ambitions. Historians and biographers have debated the extent of his direct involvement in the violent underworld of campus gangsterism, with evidence suggesting that while he ran in dangerous circles, carried firearms for self-protection, and participated in the brutal ecosystem of student politics, he maintained a distinct independence that prevented him from being entirely consumed or discredited by it. Despite the pervasive violence and moral decay on campus, Fidel's intellectual horizons expanded dramatically during these formative years. He devoured the works of classical political philosophers, legal theorists, and, increasingly, socialist and Marxist thinkers. While he was not yet a committed Marxist-Leninist during his early university years, his worldview at this stage was anchored primarily in radical Cuban nationalism, anti-imperialism, and the revolutionary democratic ideals of José Martí. He began to view Cuba's socio-economic problems through a structural lens. He recognized that Cuba's dependence on the United States, the dominance of foreign capital over national resources, and the systemic corruption of domestic political elites were the root causes of the widespread poverty and injustice he had witnessed in the Orient province. Fidel's ambition and thirst for leadership naturally pushed him to seek higher office within the student movement. He launched campaigns for leadership positions in the Federación Estudiantil Universitaria, FEU, the powerful and prestigious student organization that represented the voice of Cuban youth. His electoral campaigns on campus were legendary for their intensity, marked by marathon speeches, aggressive mobilization of supporters, and a fierce determination to outmaneuver rivals. Although he faced formidable opponents and experienced both victories and bitter defeats in campus elections, his reputation as a fearless, uncompromising, and charismatic organizer grew steadily. An essential element of Fidel's evolution during his university years was his active participation in broader anti-imperialist and regional political movements beyond the gates of the university. In 1947, Fidel joined the Cayo Conflites expedition, a clandestine military effort organized by Cuban politicians, exiled activists, and Caribbean revolutionaries to overthrow the brutal dictatorship of Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Thousands of armed volunteers, including Fidel, gathered on a remote cay off the northern coast of Cuba, training for an amphibious invasion. Although the expedition ultimately collapsed due to betrayal, political pressure from the United States, and intervention by the Cuban military, forcing Fidel to make a dramatic escape by jumping into shark-infested waters and swimming ashore. The experience profoundly radicalized him. It exposed him to international revolutionary networks, taught him the logistics of guerrilla warfare, and cemented his belief that armed struggle was a legitimate and necessary tool to overthrow entrenched tyranny in Latin America. Returning to Havana, Fidel threw himself back into his legal studies and campus political battles. The political climate in Cuba was deteriorating rapidly under the administration of President Carlos Prayo Socarrás, marked by escalating violence, police brutality against labor unions and students, and deepening economic hardship. Fidel emerged as a leading voice of fierce opposition, organizing protests, writing incendiary articles for student publications, and speaking out against government corruption with mounting fervor. It was during this period that he also forged crucial personal relationships, including his acquaintance with fellow students and future revolutionaries, though his relationships were often defined by his absolute insistence on dominance and control. By the time Fidel Castro graduated with his doctorate in law in the early 1950s, the passionate, ambitious law student had transformed into a seasoned political activist. The university had not moderated him. Rather, it had sharpened his tactical skills, hardened his resolve, and validated his conviction that the existing political order was entirely unreformable. He had witnessed firsthand how the institutions of the Cuban Republic, the courts, the parliament, the police, and the presidency, were hollowed out by corruption and subservient to foreign interests. Armed with his legal training an encyclopedic knowledge of Cuban history, an ironclad will, and a growing network of radical peers, Fidel stood at the threshold of national politics. The boy from Birán, shaped by rural privilege and Jesuit discipline, had been forged by the violent, nationalistic crucible of the University of Havana into a revolutionary waiting for his historical moment. The political landscape of Cuba shifted violently in the pre-dawn hours of March 10, 1952, shattering the fragile framework of constitutional democracy and thrusting the nation onto a collision course with dictatorship. General Fulgencio Batista, a dominant figure in Cuban politics for 2 decades who had previously ruled as an elected president, realized that his electoral prospects in the upcoming June presidential race were dismal. Trailing far behind in public opinion polls and lacking genuine popular enthusiasm, Batista chose a shortcut back to supreme authority. Moving with swift, calculated precision, Army units loyal to him seized control of Camp Colombia, the nation's primary military headquarters outside Havana, along with strategic radio stations, police precincts, and government installations. President Carlos Prio Sacaraz, caught off guard and unwilling or unable to mount a sustained military defense, fled into exile. Within little more than an hour, the military coup was complete. Batista suspended the Constitution of 1940, dissolved Congress, canceled the scheduled elections, and established a de facto military dictatorship backed by the armed forces and eager to secure its hold on the island. For ordinary citizens, intellectuals, and student leaders, the coup was a devastating betrayal that closed off all peaceful, institutional avenues for national renewal and political change. Fidel Castro, who had recently graduated from the University of Havana with a doctorate in law, and had been poised to run for a seat in the House of Representatives as a candidate for the opposition Cuban People's Party, experienced the coup as a profound personal and national crisis. The morning news of Batista's seizure of power found Fidel not in academic halls, but grappling directly with the stark reality of a stolen civic future. Unlike many established politicians who retreated into cautious silence, issued empty rhetorical protests, or sought accommodation with the new regime, Fidel reacted with immediate, incandescent outrage. He recognized instantly that the coup was not merely a change of administration, but a fundamental foreclosure of Cuba's democratic evolution. The traditional political parties, paralyzed by division and cowardice, proved utterly incapable of mounting an effective resistance. Observing this institutional collapse, Fidel concluded with absolute clarity that legalistic appeals, parliamentary maneuverings, and moderate opposition politics were entirely dead ends under a military dictator who answered only to force. In the days and weeks following March 10, Fidel embarked on a furious campaign to challenge the dictatorship using the very legal instruments the regime was trampling. He drafted formal legal petitions and compiled exhaustive documentation accusing Batista and his co-conspirators of treason, subversion of the constitutional order, and high crimes against the Republic. He argued before the courts that citizens had an inherent, legal, and moral right to resist and overthrow usurpers who seized power by force. Predictably, Cuba's judicial system, increasingly intimidated and co-opted by the military junta, summarily dismissed his petitions and ignored his legal briefs. This rejection served a vital purpose in Fidel's political education. It systematically stripped away any lingering illusions he held about the neutrality of the state's legal machinery. If the courts refused to uphold the Constitution against a military tyrant, then the Constitution itself had been reduced to a scrap of paper, leaving force as the sole remaining arbiter of political destiny in Cuba. Undeterred by judicial apathy, Fidel shifted his focus from the courts to the streets, seeking out allies among disaffected university students, radical youth groups, and working-class neighborhoods who shared his intense detestation for the new regime. He understood that opposing a heavily armed dictatorship required more than sporadic street protests or passionate declarations. It demanded rigorous organization, strict discipline, and an uncompromising commitment to direct action. Operating in the shadows of Havana, he began gathering a tight-knit circle of trusted comrades, many of whom had shared his militant experiences in the student movement. They met in clandestine safe houses, printing pamphlets, discussing revolutionary strategy, and laying the groundwork for an underground network. Fidel's towering physical stature, relentless energy, and mesmerizing oratorical skill made him a natural focal point for these disparate elements of anti-Batista resistance, cementing his reputation as a young leader of exceptional daring. During this intense period of clandestine organizing, Fidel's ideological worldview underwent a profound crystallization. While he was deeply influenced by the anti-imperialist nationalism of 19th-century Cuban independence hero José Martí, he also immersed himself in radical socio-economic critiques, analyzing how Cuba's systemic poverty, rural destitution, and economic dependency on foreign capital were inextricably linked to its corrupt political structure. He argued passionately to his growing band of followers that political independence was a hollow shell without social justice, and that any future uprising could not merely replace one set of elites with another, but had to fundamentally transform Cuban society in favor of the workers, peasants, and marginalized masses. These ideas did not yet constitute a rigid dogma, but rather a fierce, action-oriented revolutionary nationalism that resonated deeply with a generation of young Cubans who felt betrayed by their country's trajectory. As months passed under Batista's tightening grip, arbitrary arrests, police censorship, and state-sanctioned violence became daily features of Cuban life. Dissidents were silenced, labor unions were brought under government control, and university autonomy was increasingly violated by security forces. For Fidel, the creeping atmosphere of tyranny confirmed that peaceful opposition was an exercise in futility. He became entirely convinced that the Batista regime could never be dislodged by ballots, petitions, or general strikes alone. The dictatorship rested on the point of a bayonet, and therefore it could only be removed by the sharper, harder point of a counter-bayonet. This realization marked the definitive turning point in Fidel's trajectory. The ambitious young lawyer and political aspirant fully transformed into a revolutionary strategist, irrevocably committed to the path of armed rebellion as the only remaining hope for the Cuban nation. By late 1952 and early 1953, Fidel's clandestine network had evolved into a dedicated paramilitary organization composed largely of working-class youth, students, and radical professionals who were willing to risk everything to shatter the climate of national resignation. Operating beneath the intelligence radar of Batista's secret police, Fidel began recruiting hundreds of young men across the island, organizing them into secretive cells, and instilling in them a rigorous code of operational security and revolutionary discipline. He financed these clandestine operations through personal savings, contributions from sympathetic supporters, and funds scraped together from meager resources. He rented secluded properties in the outskirts of towns and cities, transforming them into training camps where recruits drilled in secret, studied the mechanics of weapons, and prepared themselves mentally for the sacrifices ahead. The atmospheric tension within Cuba reached a boiling point as the anniversary of past national struggles approached. Fidel and his inner circle worked tirelessly, driven by an almost messianic belief that a single, bold, and dramatic stroke could awaken the dormant consciousness of the Cuban people and spark a nationwide insurrection against the dictatorship. They meticulously planned an audacious military operation, an assault on a major military installation that would capture a vast cache of weapons, demonstrate the vulnerability of the regime, and provide the spark to ignite a popular revolution. As Fidel finalized the logistics, distributed aliases, and assigned tactical roles to his eager followers, he stood at the precipice of history, fully aware that failure meant certain imprisonment or death, yet utterly resolute in his conviction that the road to rebellion was the only path forward for Cuba's survival and redemption. The night of July 25, 1953, hung heavy and humid over the eastern province of Santiago de Cuba. In the shadows of the historic city, a convoy of civilian automobiles carrying more than 100 young revolutionaries quietly assembled. They were members of the generation that felt utterly betrayed by Fulgencio Batista's military coup, youth who had traded university classrooms, jobs, and quiet futures for the immense hazard of armed rebellion. Leading them was Fidel Castro, a 26-year-old lawyer whose fierce dedication and absolute refusal to accept national resignation had forged an underground army out of sheer willpower. Their objective was nothing less than audacious: to launch a surprise dawn assault on the Moncada barracks, the second largest military garrison in the country, seize its vast armory of weapons, and broadcast a call to arms that would ignite a nationwide uprising against the dictatorship. As the first pale light of dawn broke on the morning of July 26, the careful precision required for the surprise attack began to unravel under the fog of war. The caravan of vehicles became separated on the winding streets of Santiago, and the car carrying the rebels' heavy weapons took a wrong turn, leaving the main assault force short of vital firepower. Despite these devastating setbacks, Fidel and his followers pressed forward. A vanguard group advanced to take control of the nearby civil hospital, while another secured the Palace of Justice. Fidel, driving at the head of the main formation, attempted to penetrate the outer gates of the fortress. However, an unexpected encounter with alert guards prematurely triggered the alarm. The element of surprise, upon which the entire tactical plan depended, was shattered in an instant. What followed was a brief, chaotic, and unequal firefight. The thick concrete walls and superior weaponry of the heavily fortified military garrison proved insurmountable for a band of lightly armed insurgents. Realizing that the assault could no longer succeed, and to prevent the needless slaughter of his remaining followers, Fidel ordered a retreat into the rugged nearby mountains and the surrounding countryside. But escape was exceedingly difficult. Within hours, Batista declared a state of emergency, unleashed a wave of brutal reprisals, and instituted a manhunt across the province. While a small number of rebels managed to slip away into safety, many others were hunted down, captured, or killed. Worst of all, the regime abandoned all prepositions of law and order, executing dozens of captured insurgents in cold blood. Fidel himself was captured days later in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra, his life spared only because arresting soldiers chose to bring him in rather than execute him on the spot. Imprisoned and isolated from his comrades, Fidel faced a legal system weaponized entirely by the military regime. The dictator's generals attempted to silence him, barring him from attending early court proceedings, and trying to keep him hidden from public view. But Fidel possessed a formidable legal mind and refused to play the role of a humbled, defeated captive, demanding his right as a qualified attorney to represent himself. He turned his trial into a grand indictment of the dictatorship itself. On October 16, 1953, standing before a tense tribunal in a small makeshift courtroom, Fidel delivered a masterclass in political rhetoric that lasted for hours. In that historic defense, which would later be smuggled out of prison and printed as a clandestine political manifesto titled "History Will Absolve Me," Fidel systematically dismantled the legitimacy of Batista's rule. He argued with fierce conviction that citizens possessed an inherent, moral, and constitutional right to rise up and overthrow a government born of treason and usurpation. Moving far beyond a mere defense against criminal charges, he outlined a sweeping socio-economic vision for Cuba's future. He detailed the profound miseries plaguing the nation, the hundreds of thousands of landless peasants trapped in rural poverty, the industrial workers robbed of their pensions, the children dying without medical care, and the staggering illiteracy blighting the countryside. He presented concrete revolutionary laws designed to redistribute land, nationalize essential services, and restore true democratic sovereignty to the Cuban people. Though the courtroom address ended with a stiff prison sentence and a transfer to the grim island prison of Isla de Pinos, the military defeat at Moncada was paradoxically transformed into a monumental political victory. The physical assault had failed, but Fidel's words echoed across the island, galvanizing a new generation of opposition and embedding the date of July 26 into the national consciousness. Through courage, audacity, and an unshakable belief in his historic mission, Fidel Castro had turned a military disaster into the foundational myth of a revitalized Cuban revolution. The iron gates of the Presidio Modelo on the Isle of Pines opened in May 1955, releasing a man who had become a national symbol of defiance. Under mounting public pressure, a rising tide of popular discontent, and a calculated political amnesty orchestrated by the Batista regime to project an image of normalization, Fidel Castro and his fellow Moncada survivors walked free. Yet prison had not broken Fidel. It had hardened his resolve, tempered his strategic thinking, and transformed him from a local agitator into the undisputed ideological leader of a brewing national insurgency. Realizing that peaceful political opposition within Cuba's corrupted constitutional framework was entirely blocked, Fidel understood that his next steps could not take place on native soil. To rebuild his fractured movement, arm his loyal followers, and train a disciplined guerrilla cadre, he needed space, safety, and time, commodities that were dangerously scarce in Batista's police state. Making a momentous decision, Fidel packed his belongings, slipped out of Cuba, and boarded a ship bound for Mexico. Mexico City in the mid-1950s was a vibrant, politically charged metropolis that served as a natural sanctuary for political exiles, dissidents, and revolutionaries from across Latin America. For Cuban exiles, it offered a clandestine haven where they could meet, organize, and plan without the constant, suffocating surveillance of Havana's military intelligence. Upon his arrival, Fidel threw himself into the exhausting work of rebuilding his underground network, raising funds from sympathetic Cuban expatriates, and rallying supporters to the banner of the movement he had named in honor of his failed assault, the 26th of July movement. Days bled into nights in cramped apartments and smoke-filled meeting rooms, where Fidel debated strategy, studied the texts of classical military theorists, and forged alliances with anyone willing to commit to the violent overthrow of the Cuban dictatorship. It was during this restless period of exile in the Mexican capital that Fidel experienced a fateful encounter that would alter the course of modern history. In the summer of 1955, through mutual political contacts, Fidel was introduced to a young, intense Argentine physician who had traveled across Latin America, witnessing firsthand the staggering poverty, social injustice, and imperial exploitation gripping the continent. His name was Ernesto Guevara, though the world would soon come to know him simply as Che. The meeting between the charismatic, loquacious Cuban lawyer and the sharp, asthmatic Argentine doctor was electric. They sat together for hours in a small apartment, talking through the night about Marxist theory, anti-imperialist struggle, Latin American history, and the absolute necessity of armed agrarian revolution. While Fidel brought sweeping national ambition, tactical brilliance, and political magnetism, Che brought a rigorous ideological framework, unwavering radicalism, and a romantic commitment to continental liberation. Despite their distinct backgrounds, one a bourgeois provincial from eastern Cuba, the other a middle-class wanderer from the southern cone, they discovered a profound ideological synergy. Che quickly signed up as the expedition's doctor, sealing a partnership that would become the beating heart of the Cuban Revolution. With Che by his side, Fidel intensified the preparations for war, turning the Mexican exile community into a rigorous military training camp. Securing a secluded ranch outside Mexico City, the small band of Cuban revolutionaries subjected themselves to grueling physical conditioning, tactical drills, weapons handling, and instruction in guerrilla warfare. They learned how to march through dense thickets without making a sound, how to ambush heavily armed convoys, how to survive on minimal rations, and how to maintain discipline under the immense psychological pressure of impending combat. Money was a constant, agonizing problem. The exiles lived on the brink of poverty, often surviving on meager meals, pawning personal watches and belongings, and relying on donations from wealthy sympathizers and democratic politicians in countries like Costa Rica and Venezuela. Compounding their dangers, Mexican federal authorities, pressured by the Cuban embassy and wary of armed foreign militants operating on their soil, began tracking the conspirators. Police raids, temporary arrests, and secret intelligence surveillance hung over the movement like a dark cloud, forcing Fidel and his men to constantly change safe houses, alter their routines, and hide their expanding cache of weapons. Despite the relentless pressure from police and the constant threat of betrayal, Fidel remained singularly focused on a single, uncompromising objective: returning to Cuba by sea. In the summer of 1956, operating through intermediaries and front companies, Fidel managed to purchase an old, rotting, wooden-hulled yacht named the Granma. Originally built as a pleasure cruiser, the vessel was completely unsuited for military operations, let alone a stormy transatlantic crossing. Measuring only about 60 feet in length, the Granma was meant to comfortably carry a dozen people at most. Yet as the departure date approached, Fidel crammed an astonishing 82 armed revolutionaries into its cramped, stifling hull, along with heavy crates of rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel barrels. The yacht was so dangerously overloaded that its waterline sat perilously close to the surface, threatening to swamp at the slightest swell. The men lived in squalor inside the ship's cramped compartments as mechanics worked feverishly around the clock to patch up its aging, temperamental diesel engine. The moment of departure arrived on a dark, rainy night in late November 1956. Slipping away from the watchful eyes of Mexican port authorities, the Granma crept quietly out of the port of Tuxpan on the eastern coast of Mexico and headed out into the turbulent waters of the Gulf of Mexico. What followed was a nightmarish maritime voyage that pushed the limits of human endurance. Almost immediately, the overloaded yacht encountered fierce winter gales and towering, violent waves that battered the fragile wooden vessel mercilessly. Nearly every single man on board, including Fidel and Chi, fell violently seasick, vomiting continuously as the ship pitched and rolled in the pitch-black darkness. Water leaked constantly into the hull, threatening to flood the engine room and short out their vital equipment. To make matters worse, the heavy weight of the military cargo made the yacht agonizingly slow and sluggish, while the radio transmitter broke down early in the voyage, cutting them off from any outside communication or coordination, with underground sabotage networks waiting back in Cuba. Compounding the physical misery of the crossing was the constant, terrifying threat of being intercepted by Batista's naval patrols or American reconnaissance planes monitoring the Caribbean shipping lanes. The regime in Havana was well aware that Fidel was planning an invasion from Mexico and had put its armed forces on high alert, stationing coastal spotters and warships along the eastern shores of Orient Province. For 7 agonizing days, the Granma fought its way across the sea, a tiny wooden speck carrying 82 desperate men toward an uncertain destiny. The psychological tension on board was palpable. Men spent their hours cleaning rifles in the cramped, foul-smelling hold, discussing political ideology, or staring out into the dark, churning horizon, knowing full well that they were sailing directly into the mouth of a waiting military trap. By the first week of December 1956, the battered yacht finally approached the mangrove-choked coastline of southeastern Cuba. The original plan had been meticulously coordinated. The maritime landing was supposed to coincide precisely with a massive, simultaneous armed uprising in the city of Santiago de Cuba, led by underground urban coordinator Frank Pies, which would distract Batista's forces and allow the guerrilla expedition to slip unnoticed into the safety of the nearby Sierra Maestra mountains. But fate, bad weather, and navigational errors conspired against them. The Granma missed its intended landing point by miles, running aground on a treacherous coral reef off Las Coloradas Beach on December 2, 1956. Instead of stepping onto dry, welcoming shores where friendly guides awaited them, the exhausted, seasick rebels found themselves wading through chest-deep, freezing swamp water, tangled mangrove roots, and treacherous mud flats under the blazing morning sun, having lost most of their heavy equipment, food supplies, and ammunition packets in the saltwater marsh. The landing was a tactical disaster from which the expedition never fully recovered in its initial hours. Isolated in the swamp without food or dry weapons, the rebel band was soon spotted by peasant scouts and military spotter planes. Within days, Batista's elite troops caught up with the scattered, exhausted insurgents at a place called Alegria de Pillo, unleashing a devastating surprise attack that shattered the revolutionary column into disarray. Many rebels were killed or captured on the spot. Others scattered in terror through the dense, unfamiliar brush, completely cut off from one another. Yet out of this catastrophic military failure, the core of the revolution miraculously survived. Fidel, Chi, and a tiny handful of surviving comrades managed to slip through the military cordon, disappearing into the dense, brooding forests of the Sierra Maestra mountains. The voyage of the Granma had ended in near-total destruction, but it marked the definitive beginning of the armed struggle, the moment when abstract revolutionary theory met the brutal, unforgiving reality of guerrilla war, setting the stage for the dramatic insurgency that would ultimately reshape the history of the Americas. The towering ridges of the Sierra Maestra Mountains rose out of the Cuban landscape like a jagged wall of green and stone. For the handful of ragged survivors who had managed to slip away from the disaster at Alegria de Pillo, These mountains were the only refuge left in the world. They were tired, hungry, and hunted. The heavy rains of December had turned the steep mountain paths into slippery ribbons of mud, and the dense jungle canopy choked out the sunlight, leaving the steep slopes shrouded in deep shadows and damp mist. Yet, as Fidel Castro gathered his remaining men beneath the thick foliage of the mountain forest, his spirit was unbroken. He knew that the dramatic failure of the Granma landing was a massive blow, but he also knew that the armed struggle had crossed a point of no return. There was no turning back to Havana, no safe exile in Mexico, and no peaceful compromise with the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. The revolution had to be won right here, in the dirt and shadows of the Sierra Maestra, or it would perish entirely. At first, survival itself was a daily battle. The tiny rebel band, numbering barely a dozen men in those initial dark weeks, was utterly cut off from the outside world. They had lost most of their rifles, their ammunition was dangerously low, and their boots were worn to shreds. For days on end, they marched through freezing mountain streams and tangled vines, their stomachs rumbling with hunger. They learned how to quiet their steps, how to recognize the sounds of approaching army patrols, and how to sleep standing up leaning against ancient tree trunks during brief, cautious halts. Fidel proved to be an iron-willed commander, driving his men forward with relentless energy. He refused to let despair take root in the camp, constantly reminding the exhausted fighters that the mountains were a natural fortress, and that time was on their side, provided they could learn the harsh rules of guerrilla warfare. Gradually, the mountain wilderness began to reveal its secrets to the insurgents, thanks in large part to the local peasants who lived scattered across the steep slopes. These Guerrillas, as the rural country folk were called, had lived for generations in desperate poverty, ignored by the wealthy politicians in Havana, exploited by wealthy landowners, and frequently terrorized by Batista's rural guard. At first, the peasants were deeply suspicious of the armed strangers appearing at their woodland doors. They had heard radio broadcasts from the government branding Fidel and his followers as dangerous bandits and communist criminals. But as the rebels moved through the settlements, paying fairly for whatever meager food they could acquire, treating sick villagers with the medical skills of Ernesto Che Guevara, and showing absolute respect for local customs, the atmosphere began to change. Trust took root, slow and steady. Soon, the peasants became the eyes and ears of the budding insurgency. They were the ones who warned the rebels when Batista's army patrols were climbing the ridges. They were the ones who smuggled small quantities of salt, coffee, tobacco, and sugar up the steep trails, hiding the goods beneath sacks of corn or inside crude wooden carts. Through this growing network of rural allies, Fidel began to build a civilian support system that transformed the isolated band of fugitives into an integrated part of the mountain community. Young men from local farming families began slipping away from their homes to join the rebel column, bringing extra rifles, hunting shotguns, and intimate knowledge of every secret trail, hidden cave, and water spring in the massive mountain range. The Sierra Maestra was no longer just a hostile wilderness. It was becoming a liberated home base. Life in the rebel camp settled into a disciplined, exhausting daily routine. Mornings began before dawn in the chilly mountain air, with the smell of roasting coffee beans and campfires hidden under thick tarpaulins to prevent smoke from rising above the tree line and alerting military spotter planes. Fidel spent hours poring over crude hand-drawn maps, listening to reports from scout patrols, and dictating revolutionary manifestos to be copied down and smuggled out to urban underground networks. He spent equal time talking with the recruits, listening to their personal stories, explaining his vision for a democratic and socially just Cuba, and instilling in them a fierce sense of political purpose. Che Guevara, meanwhile, set up a makeshift field clinic in a rocky clearing, where he treated wounded rebels and sick peasants alike, bandaging tropical ulcers, distributing scarce quinine, and reading dog-eared books on history and economics by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp when his medical duties were done. As the weeks turned into months, Fidel prepared his men for their first offensive action. The rebels could not simply hide in the mountains forever. They needed to strike a sharp blow to demonstrate to the Cuban people that the insurgency was still alive, capable of fighting back and growing in strength. The target chosen was a small, isolated military outpost located deep in the rugged terrain, known as the La Plata Garrison. The plan required absolute secrecy, meticulous timing, and iron discipline. For days, the rebels studied the approaches, mapping every line of fire and positioning their few experienced fighters around the wooden barracks. On a dark, moonless night in January 1957, the rebel column moved silently into position through the dense undergrowth, their hearts pounding in the cool mountain air. The attack on La Plata was a small-scale skirmish compared to conventional military battles, but its psychological impact was massive. Striking with sudden, ferocious violence from the surrounding darkness, the rebels caught the garrison completely off guard. Volleys of rifle fire shattered the quiet night, and within minutes, the defenders were overwhelmed, abandoning their weapons and scrambling into the brush. The rebels captured valuable rifles, ammunition, and military supplies, suffering no serious casualties. When news of the successful raid filtered down through the mountain trails and reached the cities, it created a sensation. For months, the government-controlled press in Havana had insisted that Fidel Castro and his men had been completely wiped out at Alegria de Pio. Now, the myth of government invulnerability was shattered. Radio stations whispered the news, underground broadsheets celebrated the victory, and young volunteers from Havana, Santiago, and other cities began packing their bags to journey into the mountains and join the Sierra Maestra fighters. Encouraged by this early success, Fidel expanded the scope of guerrilla operations. He established a mobile radio transmitter that would soon begin broadcasting the voice of the revolution across the island, and he welcomed adventurous foreign journalists who braved the military blockade to hike into the mountains and interview the charismatic rebel leader. The most famous of these encounters occurred early in 1957, when Herbert Matthews, a seasoned correspondent for the New York Times, was secretly guided through the military lines to meet Fidel in his mountain hideout. Matthews found Fidel sitting under the green canopy, surrounded by armed rebels, speaking with fierce conviction about freedom, social reform, and the downfall of the dictatorship. The resulting interview, published with striking photographs in the American newspaper, shocked Washington and electrified Cuba. It proved to the entire world that Fidel Castro was alive, well, and commanding an active army in the heart of the Sierra Maestra. Fulgencio Batista's regime responded to these developments with furious counterattacks. Realizing that the insurgency was gaining deep roots among the rural population, the military launched massive sweeps through the mountain range, sending thousands of heavily armed troops up the steep slopes supported by artillery and aircraft. Villages suspected of aiding the rebels were bombed, homes were burned to the ground, and suspected civilian collaborators were rounded up or driven from the region. The pressure on the rebel camp was immense. There were times when the guerrilla column had to split into smaller, highly mobile units, constantly moving from peak to avoid being trapped in a pincer movement by superior government forces. Yet the very terrain that protected the rebels worked against the heavy, mechanized army. Batista's soldiers were unaccustomed to mountain warfare, exhausted by the heat and humidity, burdened by heavy equipment, and terrified of ambushes lurking around every bend in the muddy trails. During these grueling months of military pressure, the rebel army learned the classic tactics of guerrilla warfare: hit hard and fast, vanish into the jungle before the enemy can organize a defense, and never fight a stationary battle where the army's superior firepower can be brought to bear. They ambushed supply convoys winding along mountain roads, captured isolated outposts, and slipped away into the mist before reinforcements could arrive. Morale among the fighters remained surprisingly high, sustained by a shared sense of mission and the magnetic leadership of Fidel, who shared every hardship, marched at the head of the column, and led by personal example in every critical moment. By the end of 1957, the tiny band of survivors from the Granma had grown into a disciplined, seasoned guerrilla army capable of challenging Batista's forces across the entire eastern region of Cuba. The Sierra Maestra had transformed from a lonely refuge into a secure base of operations and a symbol of national resistance. The transformation was complete. The fragile insurgency that had begun in a muddy swamp had survived its baptism by fire, forged unbreakable bonds with the rural peasantry, and laid the solid military foundation for the final, sweeping campaign that would eventually carry the revolution all the way to the streets of Havana. The final hours of the year 1958 brought a sudden and staggering collapse to the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. As rebel columns led by Ernesto Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos achieved decisive victories in central Cuba, capturing the city of Santa Clara and cutting the island in half, the foundations of the regime evaporated. In the dark, early morning hours of January 1, 1959, realization struck the presidential palace. Realizing that his military commanders could no longer hold back the advancing insurgency, and that his grip on power was completely broken, Fulgencio Batista quietly packed his closest associates, boarded a private plane, and fled Cuba into exile. The tyrant who had ruled the nation with an iron fist for nearly 7 years was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum in the capital and an island gripped by intense nervous anticipation. News of the dictator's flight spread through the streets of Havana like wildfire. At first, there was disbelief, quickly followed by an eruption of pure, unbridled joy. People poured out of their homes, filling the broad avenues and narrow alleys alike. Church bells rang out across the city, car horns blared in chaotic harmony, and thousands of citizens waved the red and black flags of the July 26 movement. For years, the populace had endured a climate of fear marked by secret police patrols, arbitrary arrests, censorship, and political violence. Now, that oppressive atmosphere shattered overnight. Jubilant crowds tore down signs bearing the names of regime figures, while others swarmed public squares to celebrate the dawn of a new era. Yet beneath the euphoria, a profound sense of uncertainty hung in the air. No one knew for certain who would step forward to guide the country out of the chaos, or what kind of political order would emerge from the wreckage of the dictatorship. Fidel Castro, meanwhile, was hundreds of miles away in the eastern province of Orient when the flight occurred. Recognizing that he needed to assert his authority immediately to prevent his political rivals or opportunistic military officers from hijacking the fruits of the revolution, Fidel transformed his physical distance into a strategic triumph. Instead of rushing straight to the capital by air, he initiated a triumphant, island-long journey known as the Freedom Caravan. Traveling slowly across Cuba from Santiago to Havana toward the capital, stopping in towns and cities along the way, Fidel and his bearded guerrilla fighters turned the trek into a massive public demonstration of revolutionary power and popular adoration. Standing atop tanks and armored vehicles, wearing their olive-green combat fatigues worn from months in the mountains. The rebels were greeted by millions of cheering citizens who lined the highways for miles, tossing flowers, shouting slogans, and straining to catch a glimpse of the charismatic leader who had defeated the regime. The journey across the provinces took an entire week, acting as a slow-motion political campaign that cemented Fidel's status as the undisputed hero of the national liberation. By the time the caravan finally reached the outskirts of Havana on January 8, 1959, the city was transformed into a sea of humanity. Hundreds of thousands of habaneros jammed the streets, hanging from balconies, sitting on rooftops, and pressing tightly against the military vehicles. Fidel headed straight for the Columbia Barracks, the largest military installation in the capital, which was soon to be converted from a symbol of military oppression into a sprawling educational center. Stepping up to the microphone before a massive, spellbound audience under the warm Caribbean sun, Fidel delivered a historic speech that lasted deep into the night. In his address, Fidel reflected on the immense sacrifices made by the thousands of Cubans who had fallen during the long years of underground struggle and guerrilla warfare. He warned the cheering crowds that the triumph was only the beginning of a much harder journey, noting that the true revolution was yet to be built, and that the path ahead would be fraught with immense challenges. He spoke of national dignity, social justice, and the deep-seated desire of the Cuban people to finally govern their own destiny free from foreign dictation and domestic corruption. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a collective idealism that united people from all social classes, workers, students, intellectuals, and peasants, who believed they were witnessing the birth of a genuinely free and democratic society. Yet, behind the initial scenes of unity and triumphal celebration, the early steps of the revolutionary government revealed deep complexities. In the days preceding Fidel's arrival, a provisional president, Manuel Urrutia Leo, had been designated to head a transitional civilian administration, and a cabinet composed of moderate and reform-minded figures was hastily assembled. These early administrative choices reflected a broad coalition that included various anti-Batista factions, ranging from democratic reformers to radical socialists. However, the real power on the island clearly resided with Fidel and his inner circle of guerrilla commanders from the Sierra Maestra. The old political structures of the Republic had been thoroughly discredited and swept away, but the institutional framework of the new state was entirely unformed, leaving a delicate balance of forces at the top. The uncertainty surrounding Cuba's new political direction was felt not only domestically, but also internationally, particularly just 90 miles to the north in Washington. American officials watched the collapse of Batista's regime and the triumphant entry of the bearded revolutionaries with a mixture of apprehension and watchful caution. While the United States government officially recognized the new provisional administration within days, deep anxieties persisted regarding Fidel's intentions, his radical rhetoric, and the future of American economic interests on the island. Sugar mills, utility companies, and vast tracts of agricultural land owned by foreign corporations suddenly faced an unpredictable future under a government driven by fierce nationalist fervor. As the lights of Havana twinkled across the Malecon that January evening, the immediate euphoria of victory began to give way to the sobering realities of governance. The armed struggle in the mountains had ended in total victory, but the battle to shape Cuba's identity, economy, and society was only just beginning. The revolutionary government inherited an economy burdened by profound structural inequalities, widespread unemployment, and a heavy reliance on a single agricultural export. Fidel Castro stood at the pinnacle of his popularity, holding the absolute devotion of the masses and the unyielding loyalty of his armed forces, poised to lead the nation into an uncharted historical chapter that would forever alter the geopolitics of the Western Hemisphere. The euphoric celebrations that had welcomed the victorious rebels into Havana in January 1959 gradually gave way to the hard, grinding work of political and economic transformation. While the masses cheered for social justice, national dignity, and freedom from foreign dominance, Fidel Castro and his closest advisors knew that a political revolution alone would never satisfy the deep-seated grievances of the Cuban people. The island's economy was fundamentally structured around deep inequality, widespread rural poverty, and total reliance on a single agricultural export: sugar. Furthermore, a massive portion of Cuba's arable land, vital infrastructure, public utilities, and industrial enterprises were owned and controlled by powerful foreign corporations, primarily from the United States. To fulfill the promises of the July 26 movement and secure true sovereignty, the new leadership believed they had to dismantle the old economic order root and branch. In the opening months of the revolutionary government, the cabinet introduced moderate reforms designed to win broad public support and address the most glaring social needs. Rents on urban housing were slashed by up to half, electricity and telephone rates were reduced, and public works projects were launched to provide immediate jobs for the urban unemployed. Yet these initial measures were merely precursors to the monumental shift that would define the entire trajectory of the revolution. That shift arrived on May 17, 1959, when Fidel Castro signed the first Agrarian Reform Act into law. Drafted at the rebel command headquarters in the Sierra Maestra before the final victory, this sweeping legislation banned large private landholdings, placed a strict limit on the maximum size of private estates, and expropriated excess acreage held by domestic oligarchs and massive foreign agribusinesses. Under the terms of the agrarian reform, millions of acres of land were seized by the state and redistributed. Instead of dividing every estate into small, independent family farms, the revolutionary government chose to organize much of the expropriated land into state-run collective farms and agricultural cooperatives. For hundreds of thousands of impoverished rural campesinos, who had lived for generations as tenants or landless agricultural laborers working under brutal seasonal conditions, the reform was a historic liberation. They received titles to land or stable employment, along with promises of rural schools, clinics, and modern housing. However, the sweeping nature of the law provoked immediate and fierce resistance from wealthy landowners and sugar plantation owners, many of whom maintained deep commercial and political ties to the United States. Furthermore, because the law offered compensation in long-term government bonds rather than immediate cash, American corporations and the United States government viewed the expropriations as an alarming assault on private property rights. As the government pressed forward with land redistribution, political tensions within the ruling coalition began to crack wide open. The original cabinet, hastily assembled in the final days of the Batista dictatorship, was a fragile alliance that included moderate reformers, liberal constitutionalists, and anti-communist Democrats who envisioned a capitalist democracy aligned with traditional Western values. Figures like Prime Minister José Mauro Cardona and Provisional President Manuel Urrutia Leo grew increasingly uncomfortable with the rapid pace of radicalization, the rising influence of committed Marxists within the state apparatus, and the centralization of all decision-making power in the hands of Fidel Castro. By mid-1959, The ideological fault lines within the government could no longer be patched over. Fidel recognized that true structural transformation could not coexist with a fractured government or a hesitant bureaucracy. In July 1959, in a dramatic political maneuver that demonstrated his unmatched mastery of public sentiment, Fidel temporarily resigned as prime minister, accusing President Urrutia of obstructing the revolution. Within hours, massive crowds surged into the streets of Havana, staging rallies and demanding Fidel's return to leadership. Outmaneuvered by the sheer force of popular pressure, Urrutia was forced to resign and fled into exile, replaced by Osvaldo Dortico's Torrado as president, while Fidel resumed his post as prime minister with vastly strengthened authority. This internal crisis marked a clear turning point. The moderates were systematically sidelined, and the revolution cast off its remaining institutional restraints. With political opposition neutralized at the top, the revolutionary government accelerated its nationalization policies throughout late 1959 and 1960. Following the agrarian reform, the state turned its attention to the commanding heights of the national economy. Oil refineries owned by American and British multinational corporations, Standard Oil, Texaco, and Royal Dutch Shell, found themselves caught in a major geopolitical dispute when they refused to refine Soviet crude oil, which Cuba had begun purchasing to conserve its dwindling foreign exchange reserves. In response, Fidel's government took the decisive step of seizing the refineries. This act triggered a rapid cycle of economic retaliation and counter-retaliation between Havana and Washington. The United States slashed Cuba's lucrative sugar quota, effectively cutting off the island's primary export market, prompting the Cuban government to nationalize nearly all major American-owned properties, including sugar mills, mines, cattle ranches, banks, and public utilities. As economic ties with the United States were severed one by one, Cuba's survival depended entirely on finding a new patron and trading partner. The Soviet Union stepped into this historic vacuum with remarkable speed. In February 1960, Soviet First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan arrived in Havana to sign a major trade agreement, pledging to purchase millions of tons of Cuban sugar and supply the island with vital petroleum, machinery, and industrial goods. What began as a pragmatic economic lifeline quickly evolved into a profound strategic and ideological alignment. Soviet advisors, diplomats, and technicians flooded into Havana, bringing with them not only economic aid, but also Marxist-Leninist organizational models, security assistance, and military hardware. The rapid alignment with Moscow transformed domestic political dynamics inside Cuba. The Popular Socialist Party, the traditional pro-Soviet Cuban Communist Party that had initially been skeptical of Fidel's guerrilla movement in the Sierra Maestra, found its members rising rapidly into influential positions within the new government bureaucracy, trade unions, and educational institutions. Fidel, who had previously described his ideology as a distinct form of Cuban nationalism, rooted in the ideals of José Martí, increasingly embraced Marxist-Leninist doctrine as the intellectual framework for the revolution. He argued that nationalism and socialism were inseparable in the struggle against American imperialism. This ideological transformation culminated on April 16, 1961, during a massive funeral procession for victims of the preemptive bombing raids that preceded the Bay of Pigs invasion. Standing before tens of thousands of armed militia members and weeping citizens gathered at the corner of 23rd and 12th Streets in Vedado, Fidel Castro made his ideological allegiance official. In a soaring, passionate address, he formally declared for the first time that the Cuban Revolution was socialist in character. The declaration sent shockwaves across the Western Hemisphere, cementing a profound break with the capitalist world order. By the end of 1961, the transformation of Cuba into a one-party socialist state was virtually complete. The independent press had been effectively silenced or brought under state control. Political opposition parties were banned, and civil society organizations were consolidated into mass state-run entities like the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, which monitored neighborhood activities for counter-revolutionary sentiment. Private commerce was heavily restricted through a comprehensive second urban reform and the nationalization of hundreds of small and medium-sized private businesses, including department stores, hardware shops, and restaurants. Yet, even as political freedoms contracted, the revolutionary state poured immense resources into social programs designed to uplift the poorest sectors of society. The historic literacy campaign of 1961 mobilized over 250,000 volunteers, many of them teenagers known as brigadistas, who fanned out across the mountains and countryside to teach rural peasants how to read and write, successfully driving illiteracy down to single digits in a matter of months. Concurrently, the government built hundreds of rural clinics and hospitals, established a free universal healthcare system, and expanded educational access to every corner of the island, creating deep and fiercely loyal support among the working class. Thus, through a combination of radical expropriations, sweeping social reforms, centralized political control, and an alliance with the Soviet bloc, Fidel Castro successfully engineered one of the most radical social experiments in modern history. The capitalist Republic of Cuba had been dismantled, replaced by a centralized socialist state situated just 90 miles from the most powerful capitalist nation on Earth. The stage was set for a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation that would test the resolve of the revolutionary government and push the entire world to the brink of nuclear catastrophe. The rapid and radical transformation of Cuba into a socialist state just 90 miles off the coast of Florida was viewed in Washington not merely as a domestic political shift, but as an intolerable national security threat and an open challenge to American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Throughout the Eisenhower administration, policymakers had grown increasingly alarmed by Fidel Castro's nationalization of American-owned properties, his fiery anti-imperialist rhetoric, and his growing economic and diplomatic embrace of the Soviet Union. When John F. Kennedy assumed the presidency in January 1961, he inherited a covert operation that had already been set into motion by the Central Intelligence Agency. The recruitment, training, and arming of a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles dedicated to overthrowing the revolutionary government by force. This policy of confrontation, economic strangulation, and covert subversion would define the relationship between the United States and Cuba for decades, plunging the island into a permanent state of siege and fortifying Castro's domestic legitimacy through the politics of existential defense. The first major test of this escalating conflict arrived in April 1961 with the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. The CIA-trained Brigade 2506, consisting of roughly 1,400 armed Cuban exiles, launched an amphibious assault along the southern coast of Cuba at the swampy Bay of Pigs, known locally as Bahia de Cochinos. The invasion plan, formulated under the flawed assumption that the landing would instantly trigger a widespread popular uprising against Castro and crack the loyalty of the Cuban military, proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation. Rather than rising up in revolt, the overwhelming majority of the Cuban population rallied fiercely behind the government to repel what they viewed as a foreign-backed imperialist invasion. Fidel Castro personally directed the military response from the command post at the nearby Central Highway, deploying the revolutionary armed forces, tanks, and militia units with decisive speed. The invading exiles found themselves trapped against the impassable Zapata swamp without adequate air support, cut off from escape, and heavily outnumbered by loyalist troops. Within less than 72 hours, the entire invasion force was neutralized, with over 100 exiles killed and nearly 1,200 captured. The political fallout for the Kennedy administration was devastating and immediate. President Kennedy faced intense international criticism and public humiliation for America's direct complicity in an illegal act of aggression against a sovereign state. For Fidel Castro and the revolutionary leadership, the victory at the Bay of Pigs was monumental. It validated their paranoia regarding American intentions, provided an invaluable unifying narrative of national resistance, and allowed Castro to aggressively purge remaining internal dissidents while cementing the island's ironclad alliance with the Soviet bloc. In the wake of the failed invasion, the United States intensified its efforts to isolate and destabilize Cuba through a comprehensive strategy known as Operation Mongoose. Directed by the CIA and involving multiple intelligence and military agencies, Operation Mongoose sought to coordinate economic sabotage, psychological warfare, infiltration by exile commandos, and active plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. American intelligence explored numerous bizarre and sophisticated schemes to eliminate the Cuban leader, ranging from poisoned cigars and contaminated diving suits to exploding seashells and chemical agents designed to make his beard fall out. Simultaneously, the United States exerted intense diplomatic pressure on the Organization of American States to expel Cuba from the regional body, effectively cutting the island off from continental diplomacy. The economic war escalated in tandem with covert operations. In February 1962, President Kennedy formally imposed a near-total trade embargo against Cuba, banning all imports and exports between the two nations under the authority of the Foreign Assistance Act and the Trading with the Enemy Act. The embargo cut off Cuba's access to American spare parts, industrial machinery, pharmaceuticals, and consumer goods, creating severe shortages across the island. American policymakers calculated that economic misery would eventually turn the Cuban population against Castro, forcing the regime to collapse from within. Instead, the embargo provided the revolutionary state with a powerful propaganda tool, allowing Castro to blame all domestic economic hardships, inefficiencies, and structural failures on the relentless hostility of the American blockade. Fidel Castro responded to American pressure by hardening the political and social structures of the revolution. He utilized the constant threat of foreign invasion to demand absolute unity, declaring that any dissent or criticism of government policy was tantamount to treason and collaboration with the enemy. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution expanded their surveillance networks into every urban block and rural village, monitoring citizens' behavior, distributing ration cards, and organizing mass rallies to denounce American imperialism. The population was heavily militarized through the creation of the National Revolutionary Militias, turning ordinary workers, students, and peasants into armed defenders of the socialist state. Trenches were dug along the beaches of Havana, anti-aircraft guns were positioned on rooftops, and civil defense drills became a routine part of daily life. Despite the severe economic deprivation caused by the American embargo, the Soviet Union stepped in to cushion the blow, providing vital petroleum, wheat, industrial equipment, and financial subsidies in exchange for Cuban sugar. However, this economic dependence on Moscow came with significant strategic strings attached. Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, viewed Cuba not only as an ideological ally in America's backyard, but also as a crucial geopolitical pawn in the broader global nuclear standoff with the United States. With American Jupiter intermediate-range nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy threatening Soviet cities, Khrushchev sought a way to restore the strategic balance of power. The solution he proposed to Fidel Castro in the summer of 1962 was the clandestine deployment of Soviet nuclear missiles directly onto Cuban soil. For Castro, the decision to accept Soviet nuclear missiles was fraught with political and moral complexity. While he was deeply committed to defending the revolution against what he perceived as an imminent and massive American military invasion following the Bay of Pigs, hosting nuclear weapons turned Cuba into a primary target in a potential superpower holocaust. Nevertheless, believing that the presence of Soviet missiles was the only guaranteed deterrent against a full-scale U.S. military assault, Castro agreed to the secret deployment. Throughout the late summer and early autumn of 1962, Soviet cargo ships delivered dozens of medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles, tactical nuclear warheads, Il-28 bombers, and thousands of Soviet military personnel to the island. American reconnaissance flights monitored the unusual maritime traffic and suspicious construction activity in rural Cuban provinces. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane captured photographic evidence confirming the installation of Soviet offensive nuclear missile sites in Cuba. This discovery triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis, a terrifying 13-day confrontation that brought the United States and the Soviet Union closer to nuclear war than at any other point in human history. President Kennedy rejected calls from his military advisors for an immediate airstrike and invasion, opting instead for a naval quarantine, termed a blockade to avoid international legal complications, around the island to prevent further Soviet military shipments from reaching Cuba. During the peak of the crisis, Fidel Castro adopted an uncompromising and bellicose stance. Convinced that an American invasion was inevitable, he wrote urgent letters to Nikita Khrushchev urging him to launch a preemptive nuclear strike against the United States if the Americans invaded Cuba, fully aware that such an action would result in the complete destruction of his own island. Castro's rhetoric during these tense days reflected his absolute willingness to sacrifice the nation in defense of revolutionary principle, writing that the Cuban people were prepared to die with dignity rather than submit to foreign domination. The crisis was ultimately resolved through secret negotiations between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, bypassing both Castro and the Cuban government entirely. Khrushchev agreed to dismantle and withdraw the Soviet nuclear missiles in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba and a secret American agreement to remove obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey. When the terms of the agreement were announced, Fidel Castro was consumed by a deep sense of betrayal. He felt that the Soviet Union had treated Cuba merely as a disposable pawn in superpower diplomacy, denying Havana any voice in resolving a crisis that took place on its own soil. Despite his deep frustration with Moscow's unilateral decision-making, Castro realized that Cuba had nowhere else to turn. The American embargo remained firmly in place, covert operations continued, and the threat of subversion hung heavy over the island. Defying the United States had become the foundational pillar of the Cuban Revolution, shaping its domestic identity, its foreign policy, and its permanent state of mobilization. By surviving the Bay of Pigs, withstanding the economic embargo, and navigating the nuclear brinkmanship of the missile crisis, Fidel Castro had successfully transformed his personal defiance of American power into an enduring institutional reality, cementing Cuba's unique and defiant place on the global stage. The atmosphere in Havana during the autumn of 1962 was heavy with tension and anticipation. Following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and the relentless pressure of American covert operations, the revolutionary government sought absolute guarantees for its survival. In the summer of that year, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev proposed a bold and dangerous plan: the secret deployment of Soviet nuclear missiles directly onto Cuban soil. For Fidel Castro, accepting these weapons was a matter of national defense. He believed that only a nuclear deterrent could prevent a full-scale military assault by the United States. Throughout August and September, Soviet cargo ships unloaded medium-range ballistic missiles, tactical nuclear warheads, and thousands of military specialists across various ports in Cuba. American intelligence soon detected the unusual maritime activity. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft captured unmistakable photographic evidence of offensive nuclear missile sites under construction in the Cuban countryside. This discovery shattered the diplomatic calm and initiated the Cuban Missile Crisis, a terrifying 13-day nuclear standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. President John F. Kennedy immediately convened his advisors in Washington to weigh their options, ultimately rejecting a sudden military air strike in favor of a naval quarantine around the island to intercept further Soviet shipments. As American warships established the blockade, the world held its breath. In Cuba, civil defense preparations intensified to an unprecedented degree. Trenches were dug across city parks, anti-aircraft batteries were positioned on rooftops, and civilian militias mobilized in high alert. Fidel Castro adopted an uncompromising posture throughout the crisis. Convinced that an American invasion was imminent, he communicated urgently with Moscow, arguing that if the United States launched an assault, decisive measures must be taken. His revolutionary rhetoric during those tense days reflected an absolute readiness to face total destruction rather than capitulate to foreign pressure or surrender the sovereignty of the island. Behind closed doors, however, high-stakes diplomacy was unfolding between Washington and Moscow, entirely without the participation of the Cuban leadership. Premier Khrushchev and President Kennedy exchanged a series of frantic letters to find a peaceful resolution before military commanders could trigger a catastrophic exchange. The standoff finally ended when Khrushchev agreed to dismantle and withdraw the Soviet nuclear missiles. In return, the United States made a public pledge not to invade Cuba and secretly agreed to remove its own obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey. When the terms of the agreement were publicly announced, Fidel Castro experienced a bitter sense of betrayal. He realized that the Soviet superpower had negotiated directly with Washington, treating Cuba merely as a pawn on a global chessboard. He had been denied any voice in deciding the fate of weapons stationed on his own territory. Despite this profound frustration, Castro understood that Cuba had no alternative ally. The American economic embargo remained fully active, and the threat of subversion persisted. The resolution of the missile crisis left Cuba in a unique position, deeply dependent on Soviet economic aid, yet fiercely independent in spirit. having survived the most dangerous nuclear standoff in human history. The resolution of the 1962 missile crisis left Cuba in a profoundly altered state, and at the center of this transformed nation stood Fidel Castro, the undisputed maximum leader. Having survived the terrifying nuclear standoff and the betrayal of the Soviet-American back-channel negotiations, Castro turned his formidable energy inward. He set out to consolidate absolute power, reshape Cuban society from top to bottom, and build a political system that was inextricably linked to his own identity. The chaotic, pluralistic political landscape of pre-revolutionary Cuba was completely dismantled, replaced by a centralized, monolithic structure designed to withstand external threats, internal dissent, and economic hardship. Governance in post-crisis Cuba became synonymous with the person of Fidel Castro, while the formal apparatus of the Cuban Communist Party was established and institutionalized during the late 1960s and 1970s. Ultimate decision-making authority always rested with him. Castro was not a traditional bureaucrat who sat behind a desk reviewing paperwork. He was a populist orator who ruled through direct contact with the masses. His marathon speeches, often lasting 4, 5, or 6 hours under the tropical sun, became the primary medium of political communication in the country. In these epic addresses, delivered in the Plaza de la Revolution before vast, cheering crowds, Castro articulated the goals of the state, defended revolutionary ideology, rallied citizens against imperialist aggression, and explained economic shortages. He spoke not merely as a head of state, but as a revolutionary teacher instructing his people, creating an intense personal bond with millions of Cubans who viewed him as the ultimate protector of the nation's dignity. This consolidation of power, however, came at a heavy cost to political pluralism and individual liberties. From the earliest days of the victory in Havana, Castro made it clear that opposition would not be tolerated. Independent newspapers, radio stations, and television channels were systematically closed, nationalized, or brought under strict state control to ensure that only the voice of the revolution was heard. Political parties other than the Communist Party were banned, and potential rivals within the revolutionary coalition who advocated for a more moderate or democratic path were either sidelined, imprisoned, or forced into exile. Labor unions lost their independence and were transformed into instruments of state planning, tasked with increasing productivity rather than advocating for workers against management. The state security apparatus, modeled and trained with assistance from Eastern Bloc intelligence experts, developed a pervasive network of surveillance. The Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, established block by block across every neighborhood in cities and towns, functioned as the eyes and ears of the government, monitoring civilian activities, organizing volunteer labor, and rooting out suspected counter-revolutionaries. For those who dared to challenge the regime openly, the consequences were severe, leading to long prison terms, harassment, or forced departure from the island. Yet, while political freedoms contracted sharply, the revolutionary government poured massive resources into social programs that fundamentally transformed the everyday lives of ordinary Cubans, particularly the rural poor and working classes. Castro understood that the legitimacy of his regime depended on delivering tangible improvements in health, education, and social equity. In the years following the consolidation of power, the government launched the historic National Literacy Campaign, mobilizing thousands of youthful volunteers who fanned out into mountains and remote countryside regions to teach peasants how to read and write. Illiteracy was drastically reduced in a remarkably short span of time, a feat praised even by international observers who were otherwise critical of the regime. Education was made universally free and accessible at all levels, from primary schools to universities, creating a vast network of technical and academic institutions designed to supply the new socialist state with skilled professionals. Parallel to the educational transformation was the total overhaul of the healthcare system. The revolutionary state established a comprehensive, centralized medical infrastructure that prioritized preventive medicine and universal access. Clinics, hospitals, and specialized medical institutes were built across the island, reaching rural communities that had never before seen a doctor. Medical school enrollment expanded exponentially, and the training of physicians became a point of national pride. Cuba began training thousands of doctors, not only for domestic service, but also as part of an ambitious international medical diplomacy program, sending healthcare professionals to assist developing nations across Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. For Castro, healthcare and education were the crowning achievements of the revolution, tangible proof that socialism could eradicate poverty, ignorance, and disease even under the heavy burden of an American economic embargo. At the center of this vast social and political machinery was Castro's relentless work ethic and meticulous control over state affairs. He famously operated on his own schedule, often working through the night, receiving reports, making snap decisions on everything from agricultural irrigation projects to international diplomatic strategy, and inspecting factories, farms, and construction sites in person. His image was ubiquitous across the island. Billboards bearing his portraits, quotes painted on walls, and photographs in classrooms and shop windows reinforced the cult of personality that grew around him. He was revered by his supporters as El Comandante en Chief, a visionary strategist who had successfully defied the most powerful empire in the world and created a sanctuary of social justice in the Caribbean. At the same time, the institutionalization of the revolution created a rigid economic and bureaucratic structure that struggled with chronic inefficiencies. Centralized state planning, modeled closely on Soviet methods, frequently failed to account for local economic realities, leading to severe shortages of consumer goods, rationing of basic foodstuffs, and structural stagnation in key agricultural sectors such as sugar production. Despite repeated campaigns to diversify the economy and achieve self-sufficiency, Cuba remained dependent on foreign subsidies, first from the Soviet bloc, and later through shifting international alliances. The state controlled virtually every aspect of economic life, from large-scale manufacturing down to corner grocery stores and street vendors, stifling private enterprise and individual initiative. Despite these economic constraints and the pervasive atmosphere of political surveillance, Castro maintained a deep and genuine connection with a large segment of the Cuban population. Millions genuinely believed in his vision of national sovereignty, social equality, and anti-imperialist resistance. They saw in him a leader who had restored Cuba's pride on the global stage, ensuring that the small island nation would never again be treated as a political or economic appendage of its northern neighbor. As the decades progressed, the maximum leader evolved from a young, bearded guerrilla fighter into the patriarchal figurehead of Cuban society, an enduring symbol of defiance whose political identity remained entirely forged in the fires of revolutionary struggle. Even as Fidel Castro cemented his absolute control over domestic affairs within Cuba, his ambitions extended far beyond the shores of the island. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Cuban leader pursued an active and assertive foreign policy that transformed his small Caribbean nation into a global player during the Cold War. Guided by the principles of revolutionary internationalism and a fierce anti-imperialist ethos, Castro sought to champion liberation movements across the developing world, projecting a global influence that far exceeded Cuba's physical size and economic weight. In the early years following the revolution, Havana had attempted to spark immediate armed uprisings throughout Latin America, inspired by the romantic belief that the Sierra Maestra model could be swiftly replicated across the continent. The death of Ernesto Che Guevara in Bolivia in 1967 marked the painful end of that first phase, forcing Castro to reevaluate his approach to foreign intervention. Rather than abandoning global ambitions, however, Cuba shifted its strategy toward building formal state alliances, supporting established leftist governments, and deploying large-scale civilian and military missions to strategically vital regions, particularly in Africa. Africa became the primary theater for Cuba's internationalist ambitions. Castro viewed solidarity with African nations not only as a political duty, but as a historic moral responsibility, frequently emphasizing the deep cultural and ancestral ties binding the Cuban people to the African continent through the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. This vision materialized on a massive scale in late 1975, when Castro made the momentous decision to launch Operation Carlota, dispatching thousands of combat troops to Angola to protect the newly independent leftist government from invading South African forces and domestic rival factions. Deploying tens of thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean required an extraordinary logistical effort, much of it eventually coordinated with Soviet transport assistance, though the initial decision to send troops was made independently by Havana. Cuban troops fought major conventional military campaigns in the difficult terrain of southern Africa, culminating in pivotal engagements that checked South Africa's regional ambitions and profoundly altered the geopolitical balance of the continent. Shortly after the deployment to Angola, Cuba intervened in the Horn of Africa during the Ogaden War, sending thousands of troops to assist the Ethiopian government against Somali forces. Beyond military deployments, Cuba's international footprint was defined by extensive civilian cooperation programs. Thousands of Cuban doctors, nurses, teachers, agronomists, and construction engineers were sent to dozens of developing nations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These civilian internationalists built schools, established rural health networks, and provided essential services free of charge to impoverished populations who had previously lacked access to basic care. For Castro, these medical and educational brigades were a purer expression of revolutionary solidarity, proving that socialism could offer a humane and practical alternative to Western capitalism in the global South. Back home, these foreign adventures were presented to the Cuban public as proof of the nation's revolutionary nobility and moral strength. Rallies in the Plaza de la Revolution frequently honored returning internationalist fighters, fostering a deep sense of national pride and collective purpose. Yet these global commitments also imposed a heavy burden on an already strained domestic economy. Thousands of young Cubans served tours of duty overseas, and the cost of maintaining large military forces abroad required substantial economic backing, reinforcing Cuba's reliance on Soviet subsidies. Despite these strains, Castro's foreign policy succeeded in securing Cuba's position as a leader of the non-aligned movement, giving the island a diplomatic voice and a global reputation that resonated far beyond the confines of the Cold War rivalry. Even as Fidel Castro projected his influence across the globe through military interventions and international solidarity programs, the foundation of Cuba's economic survival was quietly resting on a fragile and unsustainable pillar: the Soviet Union. For decades, the partnership between Havana and Moscow had provided the oxygen that kept the Cuban socialist experiment alive. Following the United States trade embargo imposed in the early 1960s, Cuba had completely redirected its economic life toward the socialist bloc. The island traded its primary agricultural product, sugar, almost exclusively with the Soviet Union and its Council for Mutual Economic Assistance partners. In return, Moscow supplied Cuba with crucial manufactured goods, heavy machinery, food supplies, and most importantly, heavily subsidized petroleum. This trade arrangement was designed to shield the Cuban economy from the capitalist market, but it also created a deep structural dependency. Cuba produced very few manufactured items for export, and its industrial modernization remained stunted, leaving the nation structurally vulnerable to any disruption in the Eastern Bloc. For ordinary Cuban citizens, life during the 1970s and 1980s was characterized by a distinct rhythm of modest security balanced by persistent scarcity. The revolutionary government had successfully eliminated extreme poverty, eradicating illiteracy, and establishing universal access to healthcare and education. Every citizen received a ration book, known locally as the Libertad, which guaranteed a monthly allotment of basic food items, cooking oil, soap, and clothing at heavily subsidized nominal prices. Housing was largely nationalized, and rents were low or non-existent. Yet, while basic survival was assured, consumer goods were severely limited. Walking through the streets of Havana, a visitor would notice long queues forming outside state-run grocery stores whenever a new shipment of goods arrived. Automobiles were rare and aging, mostly consisting of pre-revolutionary American sedans held together by mechanical ingenuity or boxy Soviet Ladas imported through state trade agreements. Everyday life required patience, resourcefulness, and a reliance on the informal black market to supplement what the state distribution system could not provide. Behind the facade of stability, the economic model was slowly calcifying because energy was supplied by the Soviet Union at prices far below world market rates. Cuban industries and households developed inefficient energy consumption habits. State-run enterprises often operated without strict accounting standards or profit incentives, leading to chronic waste, low labor productivity, and sluggish technological innovation. The sugar industry, which remained the crown jewel of the national economy, struggled with modernization, and agricultural diversification efforts frequently faltered due to bureaucratic centralization and inflexible planning. Despite these internal inefficiencies, the illusion of prosperity persisted as long as Soviet subsidies continued to flow across the Atlantic. Moscow pumped billions of dollars annually into the Cuban economy, covering trade deficits and underwriting the military forces that Castro deployed abroad. This fragile equilibrium was violently shattered in the late 1980s as profound political and economic changes swept through the Soviet Union. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, Moscow introduced policies of economic restructuring, known as perestroika, and political openness, known as glasnost, aimed at reforming the Soviet system and easing tensions with the West. For Castro, who viewed these reforms with deep ideological suspicion, the writing was on the wall. The Soviet Union began reducing its economic commitments to foreign allies, demanding that trade be conducted at hard currency world market prices rather than through preferential barter agreements. By 1989 and 1990, the Eastern Bloc had collapsed entirely, dissolving the trading networks that had sustained Cuba for 30 years. The oil shipments that fueled Cuban power plants and agricultural machinery plummeted overnight, and imports of vital foodstuffs and raw materials dried up. The resulting catastrophe, which Fidel Castro officially termed the special period in peacetime, plunged Cuba into the deepest economic crisis in its modern history. The nation was suddenly cast adrift without its primary economic lifeline. Across the island, factories ground to a halt for lack of electricity and raw materials. Public transportation systems collapsed as fuel shortages forced buses off the streets, leaving millions of citizens to walk or ride bicycles imported en masse from China. Daily power blackouts, lasting 12 to 16 hours at a time, plunged neighborhoods into darkness and paralyzed urban life. Refrigerators sat empty in homes as food distribution broke down, and widespread malnutrition threatened public health. The caloric intake of the average Cuban citizen dropped precipitously, and illnesses related to dietary deficiencies, such as optic neuropathy, began to appear across the population. For a revolution built on the promise of material abundance and social progress, the special period was a devastating trial. Amid this mounting desperation, social tensions within Cuba began to fracture the facade of ideological unity. The pressures of daily survival drove many citizens to seek desperate solutions, leading to illegal economic activities, petty theft, and a booming black market where anything from spare car parts to smuggled meat could be traded. Discontent simmered quietly in urban neighborhoods, occasionally boiling over into public protests or expressions of frustration against the regime. The most dramatic manifestation of this internal crisis occurred in the spring of 1980, anticipating the wider collapse, when thousands of Cubans crowded into the Peruvian embassy in Havana seeking political asylum. In response, Castro opened the port of Mariel, allowing an uncontrolled mass immigration event. Over the course of several months, more than 125,000 Cubans boarded makeshift boats, fishing vessels, and commercial ships to make the perilous crossing across the Florida Straits to the United States. The Mariel boatlift drained the island of a significant portion of its skilled workforce and professionals, while dealing a heavy psychological blow to the revolutionary leadership. Fidel Castro responded to the crisis of the special period with a mixture of uncompromising ideological rhetoric and pragmatic survival tactics. He rallied the Cuban population through impassioned marathon speeches, demanding heroic endurance and self-sacrifice to defend the homeland and preserve the socialist revolution against American opportunism. At the same time, recognizing that ideological fervor alone could not keep the lights on or feed the population, Castro reluctantly authorized sweeping economic reforms that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The government legalized the possession and circulation of the United States dollar, breaking a long-standing taboo against foreign capitalist currency. It permitted the creation of self-employed microenterprises in select sectors, opened up farmers' markets where agricultural goods could be sold at market-determined prices, and launched an aggressive campaign to transform Cuba into a major international tourist destination, inviting foreign hotel chains and investors into joint ventures. These emergency measures prevented total economic collapse, but they also introduced profound social contradictions into Cuban society. The introduction of the U.S. dollar created a stark two-tier economy. Citizens who worked in tourism received remittances from family members abroad, or participated in the legal private sector gained access to hard currency, allowing them to purchase imported goods in special state stores. Meanwhile, doctors, teachers, scientists, and engineers who remained entirely within the state-salaried sector found their wages rendered virtually worthless by inflation, creating a bizarre social inversion, where a hotel bellhop or a taxi driver could earn more in a single day than a surgeon earned in a month. Despite these painful inequalities, the resilience of the Cuban people and Castro's iron grip on political power ensured that the state weathered the worst of the storm. The years of hardship tested the physical and psychological limits of the revolution, fundamentally transforming Cuban society and forcing the regime to adapt to a harsh, unipolar world. The transition from the darkest depths of the special period into the late 1990s and early 2000s marked a complex new phase in Cuba's modern history, one defined by pragmatic adaptation, shifting global alliances, and the gradual aging of its revolutionary leadership. Fidel Castro, who had navigated the complete collapse of the socialist bloc and the sudden isolation of his country, understood that the survival of the Cuban state required finding new economic lifelines outside of the traditional Soviet sphere. While the emergency measures introduced earlier, such as legalizing the U.S. dollar, opening farmers' markets, and permitting limited self-employment, had halted the freefall of the economy, the nation remained vulnerable, impoverished, and deeply strained by the ongoing American trade embargo. To secure a new foundation for the revolution, Havana looked outward, seeking fresh economic partners in Latin America, Europe, and Asia, while quietly reshaping its domestic policies to endure a unipolar world dominated by the United States. Externally, a major turning point for Cuba's geopolitical survival arrived with the rise of the political left in Latin America, most notably through the election of Hugo Chavez as the president of Venezuela in 1998. Chavez, a fiery populist and a fierce critic of American foreign policy, viewed Fidel Castro as a political mentor and ideological inspiration. What began as a warm diplomatic friendship quickly blossomed into a profound economic and strategic alliance that rescued Cuba from its post-Soviet isolation. In exchange for thousands of Cuban doctors, educators, sports trainers, and security advisors deployed to assist social programs in Venezuela, Caracas supplied Cuba with heavily subsidized crude oil on highly favorable credit terms. This massive influx of petroleum not only solved Cuba's chronic energy shortages and powered its electrical grid, but it also allowed Havana to re-export excess oil for hard currency, providing a vital cash injection into the stagnant national budget. Beyond the partnership with Venezuela, Cuba actively courted diplomatic and commercial ties with nations that maintained independent foreign policies from Washington. China emerged as a crucial trading partner and a major source of credit, investment, and manufactured goods. Chinese locomotives, buses, heavy machinery, and home appliances flooded into Cuba, modernizing public infrastructure and replacing aging, inefficient Soviet-era equipment. Simultaneously, European and Canadian tourism companies invested heavily in building modern resort complexes along Cuba's pristine northern keys and beaches, transforming the island into a major international vacation destination for travelers from Canada, Europe, and Latin America. Tourism generated essential hard currency, creating a parallel economy that directly funded state social services, even as it deepened the economic divide between ordinary citizens who had access to foreign currency through tips or remittances, and those who relied entirely on state salaries paid in Cuban pesos. Domestically, Fidel Castro maintained his absolute grip on political power while adjusting to the realities of a changing society. The state carefully managed the limited private sector it had been forced to tolerate during the special period, occasionally tightening restrictions or levying heavy taxes on self-employed workers whenever the economy showed signs of recovery, only to loosen them again when pressures mounted. The Communist Party remained the sole legal political organization, and dissent was firmly suppressed through a combination of neighborhood surveillance committees, rapid police responses, and strict control over domestic media and public expression. Yet, despite the ongoing political repression and economic hardships, Castro retained a powerful base of loyal supporters who viewed him as the ultimate defender of national sovereignty against American imperialism. His daily presence on television screens, his marathon speeches analyzing international affairs, and his tireless touring of agricultural projects and medical facilities projected an image of enduring vigor, even as he visibly aged. As the years progressed into the mid-2000s, the physical toll of decades in power finally caught up with the aging maximum leader. Fidel Castro had survived countless assassination plots, the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the collapse of global communism, but biology proved to be an adversary he could not outmaneuver. In July 2006, following a severe gastrointestinal illness and internal bleeding, Castro underwent emergency surgery that forced him to temporarily step away from his official duties. In a historic and carefully orchestrated move, he delegated his executive powers as president of the Council of State and commander-in-chief to his younger brother, Raul Castro, who had served as the minister of the armed forces and Fidel's closest political confidant since the Sierra Maestra campaign. For the first time since the triumphant entry into Havana in January 1959, Cuba faced a future led by someone other than Fidel. The transition of authority was handled with strict institutional discipline, avoiding the chaotic power vacuum that many foreign analysts and Cuban exiles had eagerly anticipated. Raul Castro assumed the presidency permanently in February 2008, formally marking the end of Fidel's direct governance, though the older brother continued to wield considerable moral authority and influence behind the scenes through his published opinion columns, known as reflexions. Under Raul's pragmatic leadership, the Cuban government initiated a series of cautious yet significant economic updates, known as lineamientos. These reforms expanded the legal scope for self-employment, permitted citizens to buy and sell private real estate and automobiles for the first time in decades, authorized the leasing of idle state land to private farmers, and began the complex process of unifying the country's dual currency system. These changes reflected a pragmatic recognition that the revolutionary model needed structural modernization to survive in the 21st century. Fidel Castro spent his final decade living a quiet, secluded life in Havana, receiving visiting foreign dignitaries, writing essays on global climate change and international politics, and occasionally appearing in public to mark major national anniversaries. He watched as his successors navigated a rapidly changing diplomatic landscape, including the historic thawing of relations with the United States announced in late 2014 by Barack Obama and Raul Castro, which led to the reopening of embassies and a brief surge in American tourism. Even in retirement, Fidel remained the symbolic heartbeat of the Cuban Revolution, a polarizing figure who had defied 10 U.S. presidents, built a resilient socialist state 90 miles from the American mainland, and left an indelible stamp on modern world history through sheer force of will, political cunning, and uncompromising ideological conviction. The long and turbulent era of Fidel Castro came to a definitive close on November 25, 2016, when the revolutionary leader passed away at the age of 90. His death instantly reverberated across the globe, triggering a profound mixture of grief among his devoted supporters and unmasked celebration among the Cuban exile community abroad, particularly in Miami's Little Havana. Throughout the island nation, the government declared 9 days of national mourning, draping public buildings in black and white bunting, while millions of citizens lined the streets to pay their final respects. The response demonstrated the deep emotional and political polarization that had defined his rule for nearly 6 decades. For millions of ordinary Cubans, Castro was the embodiment of national dignity, anti-imperialist resistance, and social equality, while for his fierce critics, he was a ruthless authoritarian who crushed human rights, dismantled civil liberties, and plunged the country into severe economic ruin. The national funeral procession retraced in reverse the historic victory caravan of January 1959, carrying his ashes across the provinces from Havana to the cradle of the revolution in Santiago de Cuba, where he was interred in a massive granite boulder at the Santa Ifigenia Cemetery, near the mausoleum of national hero José Martí. Assessing Castro's historical legacy requires confronting a complex paradox of monumental social achievements paired with severe political repression. On one hand, the revolution under his leadership fundamentally transformed Cuban society by eradicating extreme illiteracy through a massive nationwide literacy campaign, building a world-renowned universal healthcare system that provided free medical care to every citizen, and expanding educational opportunities to marginalized rural populations who had long been ignored by previous corrupt administrations. Cuba achieved infant mortality and life expectancy rates comparable to developed Western nations, and its medical internationalism sent tens of thousands of doctors to disaster zones and impoverished regions worldwide, earning genuine gratitude and soft power across Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. Furthermore, Castro successfully asserted national sovereignty over a small island nation lying just 90 miles from the United States, defying 10 consecutive American administrations, surviving countless assassination plots, and maintaining a fiercely independent foreign policy that punched far above the country's economic weight. On the other hand, this extraordinary social progress came at an immense cost to individual freedom and political pluralism. From the earliest days of the revolution, Castro systematically dismantled independent media, closed opposition newspapers, outlawed rival political parties, and imprisoned thousands of political dissidents without fair trials. The state established a pervasive apparatus of social control through the Committees for the Defense of the Revolution, encouraging neighbor to spy on neighbor, while travel restrictions prevented ordinary Cubans from freely leaving or returning to their homeland without exit visas. Economically, the rigid adherence to a centralized state planning model, compounded by the devastating impact of the American trade embargo and the loss of Soviet subsidies, resulted in chronic shortages of food, medicine, and consumer goods, crumbling infrastructure, and a depressed standard of living that drove successive generations of young Cubans to risk their lives attempting perilous maritime escapes to the United States. The promise of economic prosperity and self-sufficiency ultimately gave way to persistent scarcity and bureaucratic stagnation. In the years following his death, the revolution entered a delicate transitional phase under his brother Raul and subsequent leaders like Miguel Díaz-Canel, attempting to preserve the core social achievements of socialism while introducing cautious economic reforms to survive in a rapidly globalizing world. Yet, the fundamental challenges facing Cuba remained deeply entrenched, exacerbated by tightened American sanctions, global economic crises, and mounting public discontent over energy blackouts and inflation. Fidel Castro's enduring place in history remains sharply divided between those who view him as a visionary liberator, who stood up to imperialism and prioritized the poor, and those who see him as a totalitarian dictator who stifled human potential in pursuit of an unachievable ideological utopia. Whether viewed as a romantic revolutionary or a ruthless tyrant, Castro irrevocably shaped the destiny of Cuba,